system of white supremacy, there's so much overlap. If you listen chronologically, so we just finished Harriet A. Washington, A Terrible Thing to Waste. They talked about environmental racism. I was surprised she mentioned fast food as a part of environmental racism for a lot of different reasons, and she talked about them being concentrated in black areas. So we just finished that Thursday. Now we're doing this book today. Next, or this coming Thursday, we are starting Chicago. We are starting Packing Them In, an archaeology of environmental racism in Chicago, 1865 to 1954 by Sylvia Hood Washington. That's for Thursday on the Book Club, Chicago. You'll see the connect when we get. I don't know if McDonald's will be mentioned in that book, but that's coming up. Are you familiar with that work, Dr. Chatlin?
I'm familiar with the first book that you mentioned, but not the last one. And I think this idea, when we think about environmental issues, when we think about environmental racism, we often think about really overt acts of, dumping chemical waste or putting housing near factories. But, when we think about the totality of the environment, it's about access to healthy food. It's about noise pollution. It's about exposure to a lot of traffic. It's about development policies that don't make sure that homes have the proper lead abatement. And so within the context of, where fast food restaurants are able to be built quickly and where that traffic goes when fast food is brought into a neighborhood is an issue that in my book, Black communities were fighting in the 70s. They were making environmental claims against McDonald's long before people were aware of the issues of cattle and how much land that takes up. Before people were talking about styrofoam, a lot of Black communities were fighting against McDonald's based on quality of life in their neighborhoods. And that was something that was so important for me to expose, to show that there has always been a long tradition of thoughtful organizing around quality of life in Black communities.
Context of White Supremacy. Gus T. Renegade in for another broadcast, hopefully to share constructive information on the system of white supremacy. Today's date, Thursday, February 27, 2020. So I have been told. This is our book club every Thursday, brand new book. We just finished up The Legend, Harriet A. Washington, A Terrible Thing to Waste, Environmental Racism, and its Assault on the American Mind. Top 10, Gus T. Renegade, just extraordinary work. I'm so glad that we read that book. Two of her works, Harriet A. Washington, you should have both of her books in your counter-racism library. So, the audio segment that you heard at the beginning of the program, that was Dr. Marcia Chatlin, Dr. Marcia Chatlin. She was with us on the program this past Monday, and we had the pleasure of discussing her book franchise, The History of the Golden Arches in Black America, a phenomenal contextualization of the relationship of McDonald's to Black people and how they have exploited, taken advantage of Black people in a myriad of ways as workers, consumers, you name it. Anyway, at the beginning of that program, I talked about how Harriet A. Washington, in her book last week, she talked about noxious alcohols, cigarettes, but she also had a segment talking about food. She talked about food throughout the book, the type of food that pregnant moms eat, the type of foods that dad, if you're trying to have a child, what type of food do you want to eat? Make sure you have healthy sperm. She talked about the types of environment, what's in your environment. Are you going to have a lot of fast food restaurants that are bringing in a lot of traffic and noxious foods and all the rest of it to your area? Or are you going to have access to healthy food? That was one of the things that she talked about in her book that I super appreciated. You heard Dr. Chatlin go into more detail, and Dr. Chatlin from the area of Chicago, the book that we are going to read right now, right in line with both of those two texts and what we have just been talking about for the last few weeks on the program. Sylvia Hood Washington, her book, Packing Them In, An Archaeology of Environmental Racism in Chicago, 1865 to 1954. This book caught my attention for a number of reasons. I've had it on my bookshelf for years, literally years. Before President Trump was even elected, I had this book. And I'm saying, man, we need to get her on the program or read it. This is important. We haven't done enough work on environmental racism. Time is right and exact, though. So we're getting to it now, thankfully. Thank you, Henry in Chicago, doing the reading. Henry in Chicago. Dr. Wells in Chicago, a lot of Chicago connections. Chicago is a very important city in the system of white supremacy. This book caught my attention because we read The Great Warmth of Other Suns, The History of the Great Migration, Isabel Wilkerson, also in Gus T's top 10. And Chicago is a big part of that book because Chicago was a big part of what they call the migration. Lots of black people confused about white supremacy racism, thinking that they were getting away from racism and just going to a different plantation in Chicago, though it may have been, somewhat better than where they were coming from. Maybe. We'll see. But white people study. We got a lot of niggers coming to this area. We got to deal with them. Got to poison, practice racism, white supremacy against them. Maybe you don't get terrorized. Maybe we don't do all the lynching and things that you experience down in Mississippi and Alabama and places that you come from. But here, we'll just dump toxic sludge on you. Then you have birth defects and all these other problems, and we'll sit around and, I don't know how that happened. Super excited to get to the book, 1865. Greta Thunberg and folks talking about environmental racism as a recent problem. This book starting in 1865 with environmental racism, white supremacy against black people in Chicago specifically. We will get started. Context of White Supremacy, our book club. This is our debut session on Sylvia Hood Washington's Packing Them In, audio segment 1.
Packing Them In, An Archaeology of Environmental Racism in Chicago, 1865 to 1954, by Sylvia Hood Washington. Introduction. Each individual has his own place, and each place its own individual. Michel Foucault, Discipline and Punish, The Birth of a Prison. I have been conscious at times of writing against the prevailing orthodoxies. Each of these orthodoxies has a certain validity. They tend to obscure the agency of working people, the degree to which they contributed by conscious efforts to the making of history. E.P. Thompson, The Making of the English Working Class. Why do a disproportionate percentage of poor, working class, and minority communities continue to suffer from environmental inequalities more than 20 years after the modern environmental justice movement? Those currently involved in discussions about the existence of environmental inequalities tied to race or class prefer to use the phrase environmental justice rather than the potentially defensive phrase of environmental racism. In accordance with the philosopher and historian Michel Foucault, I have called the history of environmental injustice discussed in this book the archaeology of environmental racism. It is my goal in this book to explain why environmental racism is a more accurate description of the past and present phenomenon, even for white communities who suffer from environmental inequalities in the United States. Race, racism, and whiteness have been fluid and changing concepts in the United States since its inception, a fact that has been well established by scholars as David Roediger, Matthew Fry Jacobson, and Ian F. Hanley Lopez. Environmental racism is a misunderstood concept in desperate need of explanation from a historical perspective because who becomes a victim of racism is contingent upon the changing notions of race. Environmental racism today is a phenomenon improperly portrayed as a struggle between blacks and whites in America. Neither blacks or whites are a part of a monolithic community, and neither have been perceived as such in the course of their history in the United States. History reveals that environmental racism has been experienced for decades by people or communities who today are classified as white. Their environmental marginalization occurred because at some point in time, they were either considered not white or part of the mainstream white community. Subsequently, they were environmentally disenfranchised. These people typically belong to what today are defined as various ethnic groups, including Irish, Polish, Jewish, Italian, and Appalachian communities. These ethnic groups were rarely, if ever, classified as black. Therefore, the argument that African Americans, Hispanics, Native Americans, and Asians are the chief targets of environmental inequalities because they were not white needs to be re-examined. The primary historical difference from an environmental perspective between people of color, especially African Americans, and white ethnic groups is that their environmentally marginalized geographical spaces were constructed by more rigid and longer-lasting race-based legal decisions and public policies that were sanctioned and endorsed by governments at all levels. Public policies, laws, and private practices that controlled or influenced where people lived and worked in the United States were tainted by notions of race, or who was non-white, for over 300 years. As a result, these policies and practices played a major role in the development of environmental inequalities in poor and working class communities of particular racial or ethnic background in the United States. This became even more prevalent after the Industrial Revolution and the urbanization of cities in the 19th century. The current body of environmental histories and studies explicitly and implicitly argues that the ability to minimize or even thwart environmental assaults upon communities became most effective in the later half of the 20th century, primarily among middle-class whites, and brought lessons learned from previous movements, a knowledge of how the system works, access to a certain amount of scientific expertise, an understanding of how to use the media, and an ability to raise enough funds to maintain viable, albeit lean organizations. This book challenges this widely accepted belief by showing that minority and poor ethnic white communities also have a history of effective environmental activism that predates the modern environmental justice movement that began in the 1980s and the white middle-class environmental movement that began in the 1970s. The underlying premise of this book is that poor, foreign, and racial groups have been and are easily constructed as others, lepers lying outside the body politic of the larger society, and that this construction is directly related to environmental racism. I use Michel Foucault's concept of others in this study to refer to a large array of environmentally marginalized groups within a society because it overcomes the simplistic dichotomy of white versus black. This construction is facilitated by differences in language or dialect, culture, and socially constructed and ever-changing categories of race and ethnicity. The construction of the other is on a cellular level, but can, within the larger society, result in the further conceptualization as a social body requiring discipline, enclosures, and management by a majority. The 20th century's Jim Crow laws, restricted covenants, racial zoning ordinances, and immigration restriction policies are examples of this type of construction and environmental discipline. These groups identified as others were and still are forced to live in geographical spaces, communities, within the society that are or becoming environmentally compromised because of their otherness. Their communities become dumping grounds where waste and toxic material are disproportionately located. Apparently, they are the proper place for everything deemed to be undesirable, people and waste. These communities become the ultimate sink for the larger body politic. Historically, normal and healthy people do not choose to live in these geographical locations of the leopard colony. They sought to maximize the distance between themselves and the lepers. Similarly, leper colonies were not given the same care and maintenance provided to non-leper colonies. I believe this phenomenon holds true for both social and political lepers. An environmental history of these groups will validate that assumption. In support of the arguments in this work, Mary Povey's seminal history, The Making of a Social Body, provides an excellent analysis of the emergence of public health policies based upon otherness in 19th century Britain. She argues that these policies could only emerge by defining poor communities in 19th century England and eventually Great Britain as being a social body separate from the body politic. This cultural phenomenon was greatly facilitated by public health policies implemented by Great Britain's famous 19th century sanitarian Edwin Chadwick to ameliorate waterborne diseases from urban sewage. Chadwick, a former barrister and self-taught sanitarian, became one of the most influential public health figures in Anglo society in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Povey points out that England's poor had to be constructed as a social body outside the defined body politic so that they could emerge as Foucault's symbolic leper and therefore justifiably be isolated and removed from the larger body. In this way, they could be easily individualized on a macromolecular level and subsequently identified as docile bodies, subject to forms of discipline that would be of benefit to the society at large. In this case, the discipline would be sanitary education and changes in architectural space in order to optimize water quality and therefore minimize the spread of typhoid and other waterborne diseases. Povey's example of sanitation policies is kindred to the environmental policies under study in my research because the sanitation problem of Britain was worse in poor and immigrant communities. These groups would bear an inequitable share of health problems emanating from environmental pollution as a result of rapid industrialization and expansion in a limited urban space. Like Povey's poor in Great Britain, Eastern European immigrants and African American migrants in Chicago were constructed as others who were not envisioned as being part of the larger body politic. From 1865 to 1940, the immigrants, mostly white, working in the Chicago packing houses, voluntarily formed extreme dense residential communities in the same or close proximate environs of the Chicago stockyards. This area was highly polluted because of legal and illegal waste disposal practices by industrialists, politicians, landlords, and the city itself. Southern African Americans who came to the area between 1915 and 1954 voluntarily moved and were later forced into Chicago's Black Belt and eventually Bronzeville. Bronzeville was the name that Black Chicagoans used to refer to their primary geographic space of occupation on the city's south side. Both groups were packed into highly degraded environmental spaces because of legal, extra-legal, and illegal waste management practices, as well as housing policies that were based upon racist and ethnocentric planning policies. Many African American migrants lived in the notorious kitchenette apartments that were fire traps and breeding grounds for tuberculosis and rats. There may have been some Eastern Europeans who lived in kitchenette apartments, but these spaces were primarily occupied by Black Chicagoan migrants coming into the city during the second migration period. Both groups waged battles to create what today are called sustainable living spaces. They fought to maintain, preserve, or restore the environmental integrity of their new homes and immediate environs. Another objective of this book is to show that environmentally marginalized groups in the United States have a history of environmental activism that predates the historical emergence of the postmodern environmental justice movement launched in 1982 in Warren County, North Carolina, by African Americans who fought unsuccessfully to prevent the disposal of hazardous soil in their communities. Critical to this thematic argument is that the term environmental racism actually embraces what I have termed environmental ethnocentrism. Written histories to date have focused on either individualized or cellular ethnic community development or labor histories. In each case, the immigrants, migrants, or minorities have been portrayed as being either unaware of the hazards emanating from environmental pollution and its concomitant diseases, less caring because of a trade-off with higher needs, economic advancement or security, or impotent in ameliorating their situation because of their social and political rank. These people were aware of pollution and its potential impact on their neighborhoods and, most importantly, their health. They made many attempts to prevent or stop the environmental degradation of their neighborhoods. Although the communities are each examined for different time spans, back of the yards from 1865 to the 1930s, and Bronzeville from 1865 to 1954, it is clearly evident that each disenfranchised or marginalized societal group, African American, migrants, and white ethnic immigrants, made active political and legal attempts to ameliorate environmentally oppressive conditions. The premise of this book reflects my experiences as an African American woman with firsthand exposure to environmental racism. As a historian, I am keenly aware that facts and reality can be distorted by memory over time, but the oral history tradition among people of African descent and other cultures around the world has been and continues to be a powerful tool of transferring the history of their communities across generations, as well as a means of obtaining the full and complete history of a geographical and cultural space or place. As the 2002 National Project Director of a historic environmental justice and health project funded by the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops and the Knights of Peter Claver Incorporated, the oldest and largest Black Catholic lay organization in the United States, I have had the opportunity to hear the environmental memories of hundreds of Black people across the country. Their experiences and memories reinforce my own memories as an African American who grew up in a middle class but racially segregated African American neighborhood during the 1960s and 70s in Cleveland, Ohio. This neighborhood was on the very outskirts of Cleveland and contagious to Eastern European immigrants or first-generation neighborhoods. Our neighborhoods share common environmental spaces that were routinely polluted by the illegal dumping of residential and industrial trash until the 1980s. The African Americans in my community fought against environmental inequalities in an era that predated the modern environmental justice movement. They organized, took political action, and influenced, as much as they could, the environmental conditions of their neighborhood, and eventually proved instrumental in preventing another mayoral term for Carl B. Stokes, the first African American mayor of Cleveland, Ohio. The African American citizens of my community believed that this African American mayor was engaged in promoting and executing environmentally racist policies. He, in turn, felt that they were environmental racists who were acting to block the acquisition of sustainable living spaces by less fortunate African Americans who had been spatially confined to the inner city. This book also inspired by my professional experiences as an environmental scientist and engineer in the power industry. My relationships with the first and second generation Eastern European engineers in the power industry gave me the opportunity to hear the memories about their families' historical environmental struggles for sustainable communities and healthy work environments in urban America. In the early 1980s, when I was working as the plant environmental engineer at the Cleveland Electrical Illuminating Company's Lakeshore coal-fired plant situated on Lake Erie, I heard a recitation of environmental memories similar to mine from a young Slovenian engineer whom I will call Joe. Joe's family had immigrated to the United States in the 1960s. As a child, he came to the United States to live with an extended family who was residing in Cleveland's notorious Flats neighborhood, situated near the city's steel mill industry. Many of Joe's relatives had suffered the physical indignities of living and working in Cleveland's steel mills and had lost limbs and suffered overall poor health because of their working conditions prior to the institution and enforcement of Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA standards. Joe told me about his uncles who fell victim to molten steel or highly pressurized steam only to return home to crowded and unsanitary housing. Joe shared his environmental stories with me because he wanted me to understand that Eastern European immigrants had also been environmentally marginalized because of their race or ethnicity. They struggled to escape the environmental disenfranchisement both on the job and in the neighborhood through hard work and education to provide them with the economic means for escaping the suburban green space. Unfortunately, these same techniques were, for decades, useless for African American migrants and their offsprings, unless they could racially pass for white, because of their visual marker of race, creating a more insidious stigma of environmental otherness. Environmental histories have been written by lay people, non-historians, and other social scientists, including such environmental sociologists as Robert Bullard in Dumping in Dixie or David Pellow in Garbage Wars. Their main emphasis, however, is not in rendering a historical narrative about people, place, and environment so much as making a contemporary analysis of the state and future of the postmodern environmental justice movement. Environmental histories written by professional historians to date have attempted to illustrate the full impacts, both positive and negative, of technologies and technological processes on modern and postmodern societies as a result of the interplay between social, cultural, and political forces. What I have noticed, however, in a large number of these histories is that there is a pervasive silence about the reactions and actions of those who seem to suffer the most and disproportionately from negative environmental impacts, the working class poor, and ethnic and minority groups. The vast majority of these histories, with the exception of Andrew Hurley's Environmental Inequalities, seem to have an implicit underlying assumption that communities that become environmentally disenfranchised are historically helpless and ignorant victims who have suffered from environmental policies because they did not understand or did not attempt to influence them until the environmental justice movement began in Warren County, North Carolina. Environmental history in the United States has an environmental veil with respect to elucidating the historical perspectives of socially marginalized communities who have experienced environmental inequalities from their own perspectives. This book and my current research is an attempt to lift that veil so that readers can see as well as hear the environmental history of these communities from the perspectives of those who have been environmentally disenfranchised. This book humbly reflects the beginning of my own research efforts to deconstruct the prevalent historical myth of century-long environmental illiteracy, complacency, and inactivity among ethnic and African American communities experiencing both environmental racism and ethnocentrism because they were willing to trade their health and the health of their families for work. A few key environmental history studies greatly shaped my desire to pursue this type of historical research. They are Andrew Hurley's Environmental Inequalities, Ted Steinburn's Nature Incorporated, Industrialization and the Waters of New England, Jeffrey Stein's Mixing the Water, and Joe Tarr's The Search for the Ultimate Sink, Urban Pollution in Historical Perspective. Each of these works address the interaction of social, political, technological, and cultural decisions that have influenced the environmental integrity of a region or a particular city. All of these histories and most of their contemporary studies have, in my opinion, permanently produced top-down environmental histories from the perspective of those in power, be it political, social, or economic, or those who have access to power. Steinberg's and Stein's history each allude, in varying degrees, to the environmental impacts on the working class and socially disenfranchised groups in American history, but never really develop the historical perspective of environmental others about the radical changes in their environmental space, which were, for the most part, negative. Jobs were created for the masses from these changes, but their living spaces became highly polluted and unsustainable from a public health perspective. Nature Incorporated and Mixing the Waters both provide richly detailed descriptions of the technocrats and other players who were key to implementing the major technological changes that transform the environment and ecosystem within a given region. The reader walks away from this literature with a clear understanding that environmental change brought about by technology cannot be decoupled from a small minority of persons who wield and have access to the majority of power and critical decision makers within a society. It is also clear in these historical narratives that the masses have very little influence or power in making technological decisions or in preventing technological decisions made by a ruling class. For instance, in Mixing the Waters, Stein provides two explanations of why the efforts of the environmentalists opposed to the construction of the Tennessee Tombigbee waterway failed. both explanations attributing the failure to the inability of the group to form consensus with other groups, the minority groups and the railroad companies who questioned the project. Stein points out, one of the most outspoken black leaders questioned the environmentalist motives and asserted that the black communities affected by the waterway stood to benefit from the creation of thousands of jobs. He charged the national environmental groups with caring more about wildlife than the desperate needs of suffering poor people. Environmentalists warned the community activists not to be misled by the promise of abundant employment opportunities, and speculated that there might be a net loss of jobs if the waterway brought an end to local employers. In Steinberg's Nature Incorporated, the reader is provided more detail from a social historical point of view into the lives and the philosophies of the dominant group, the Boston Associates, that gained control over the New England waterways as well as the opposition forces. The Boston Associates was not a formal organization, but a network of individuals and families joined by bonds of marriage, friendship, and finance. They were prominent in banking, insurance, philanthropy, and politics. Steinberg describes the associates as individuals who sought to control their environment and the economy, and he concludes that their opponents seeking to dismantle their hold on the waterways of the New England waterways achieved very little success. The Boston Associates' opponents, like those opposed to the Tennessee Tombigbee Waterway Development Authority, TTWDA, in mixing the waters, were not as cohesive or as powerful. In describing an uprising against the efforts of the Boston Associates in New Hampshire, Steinberg points out that the leaders of the riots were two people out for revenge, urging on a small group of men, most who were economically marginal, frustrated by the broader economic transformation of the region that did not benefit everyone equally. The rioters, like most of the opposition in Steinberg's study, failed to achieve their objective because they did not possess the political, social, and economic power to stop the associates. Steinberg's book does fail to provide any substantial discussion about the views of the marginalized group regarding the radical environmental transformation of both their living and working spaces as a result of the incorporation of nature. Very few environmental histories written by environmental historians deals extensively with the community response from the community's perspective to pollution. Andrew Hurley's Environmental Inequalities, Class, Race, and Industrial Pollution in Gary, Indiana, 1945 to 1980, is, to date, the only formal environmental history that directly addresses environmental inequalities. Hurley's monograph illustrates how African Americans and middle-class white women organized themselves in Gary, Indiana, to halt industrialization and suburbanization efforts that would have had a negative impact on their community. Hurley places a strong emphasis on the direct and indirect power wielded by middle-class white housewives and provides very little information on the working-class minority community. Harold Pratt at Loyola University has also dealt with community activism and environmental inequalities. Platt has presented several papers on the role of Jane Addams, founder of Chicago's Hull House Settlement, in advocating optimal environmental conditions for immigrants and the working class who have lived near the settlement house. None of these histories has been written from the perspective of the working class, minority, or ethnic community. Finally, an important historical work that ideologically shapes and influences both this book and my research is E.P. Thompson's The Making of the English Working Class. In his preface, Thompson states that some histories tend to obscure the agency of working people, the degree to which they contribute, by conscious efforts, to the making of history. It was my intent in writing this book to produce a history that reveals the agency, actions, and influences of working class, ethnic and minority groups, and women on their own environmental history. This desire to write this type of history is in response to environmental historian Martin Malosi's critique in his essay, Urban Pollution, Historical Perspective Needed. He argues that other avenues that should be explored in the environmental field are the urban environment and the political, socioeconomic, and cultural groups that shape and influence the implementation of environmental laws and culture in this system. Malosi points out there is a substantial need for historical studies that discuss the role of specific groups and individuals as pollution fighters. Very little has been written about urban-based reform groups who fought for change in legislation to improve the environment of cities. Little, too, has been written about professional groups who were engaged in environmental reform. This book relies on traditional sources of information, but also includes oral and autobiographical information because very little historical information has been recorded about the experiences of socially marginalized groups from their own perspectives. I view this work as a natural and progressive scholarly step in the current field of environmental history as opposed to environmental sociology, a new type of environmental history about the disenfranchised people impacted by inequitable environmental policies utilize political mechanisms that they tried and sometimes failed to control or influence. Environmental disenfranchisement does not arise simply from the incorporation of nature, but rather from the social construction of citizens as others, which disentitles them to an equal opportunity to have a choice to live in a healthy and clean environment. In The Search for the Ultimate Sink, Urban Pollution in Historical Perspective, Joel Tarr points out that many who advocated urban decentralization were as motivated by considerations of social control as by desire to enable men to live more comfortably or healthy lives. City slums crowded with immigrants usually had high crime rates and poor sanitary conditions, and middle and upper class citizens worried about the threat of violence and disease posed by congested working class areas. However, Tarr fails to articulate the historical fact that these congested areas have become the ultimate sink because their occupants have become environmentally disenfranchised. I structure the present work into 3 parts. Part 1, historical and philosophical foundations of environmental racism and environmental justice, includes Chapter 1, social Darwinism, scientific racism, and the birth of the environmental leper, and Chapter 2, an archaeology of the modern environmental justice movement. Chapter 1 discusses the historical and philosophical foundations for the emergence of environmental racism and ethnocentrism in 20th century America. I elucidate the historical and philosophical connection between social Darwinism, eugenics, scientific racism, and the emergence of environmental racism. The goal of this chapter is to show how the creation of environmental others was a function of how they were imagined and perceived as contributing to or detracting from the environmental health of modern society and the larger body politic, and how these perceptions were legitimized by science. Chapter 2 provides a history of national environmental movements or movements that had environmental objectives by marginalized communities in response to environmental inequalities in their communities. The goal of this chapter is to show that environmental activism and concerns among the socially and racially marginalized in this country existed prior to today's environmental movement, which began in 1982. Part 2, Packing Them In, focuses on an early environmental justice history of European immigration living in the neighborhood known as Back of the Yards, which is adjacent to the Chicago Stockyards. Chapter 3, Justice in the Jungle, elucidates the history of environmental activism in response to environmental degradation and consequential public health problems on the part of the immigrants and their descendants living near Back of the Yards, as well as that of their supporters and advocates. The goal of this chapter is not to determine whether the immigrants won or lost an environmental battle, but to establish the fact that they cared about the environmental integrity of their community and took measures to resolve environmental issues that affected their own health and the health of their community decades before today's environmental justice movement. Chapter 4, Engineering and Environmental Inequality, specifically elucidates the history of the environmental space where the immigrants came to live and how it became to be polluted as a result of political and technological decisions made by the local, state, and federal governments and city and regional planners. The west end of the Chicago River, which ran through these neighborhoods, became severely polluted and came to be known as Bubbly Creek. This chapter also provides a history of the actions that residents of this area took to resolve the pollution produced by the stockyard industries. Part 3, Broken Promises, provides a case history of early environmental justice struggles by African Americans in Chicago in the first half of the 20th century, during the first two great migration periods, when the use of restricted covenants was still legal. Chapter 5, Planning and Environmental Inequalities, shows how planning, real estate policies, and violent aggressions by neighborhood community groups bolstered by eugenics, philosophies, and scientific racism, were critical to the formation and maintenance of environmentally marginalized spaces for African Americans, especially migrants who were living in Chicago. All of these forces resulted in African Americans being packed into the Black Belt and eventually into Bronzeville, creating blighted urban spaces that had served public and environmental health impacts on this marginalized community. Chapter 6, We Fight Blight, Block Beautiful and the Urban Conservation Movement in Chicago's Black Belt, 1915 to 1954, provides an account of an early environmental justice struggle led by African Americans that sought to create sustainable communities for its members despite racial discrimination and rampant environmental disenfranchisement. The urban conservation movement, built upon an earlier block movement, was the first such movement led by African American institutions like the Chicago Defender and the Chicago Urban League. An early environmental justice history of Chicago's marginalized communities is critical to understanding why the problem still exists. This thematic point is the foundation of the book's epilogue, Raisins in the Sun. The epilogue provides an environmental history of the Altgeld Gardens community and its environmental justice organization, People for Community Recovery. The objective of this final section of the book is to provide an understanding of the complexity of resolving environmental justice struggles for marginalized communities, especially since this particular community was supposed to be the answer to urban blight and environmental marginalization faced by African Americans in Chicago beginning in the mid-1940s. In the end, it gained worldwide recognition as the worst environmental living space in Chicago because of the highly polluted geographical space upon which the community was built in an attempt to preserve the long-standing policies of racial segregation in housing in Chicago. Part 1. Historical and Philosophical Foundations of Environmental Racism and Environmental Justice. Chapter 1. Social Darwinism, Scientific Racism, and the Birth of the Environmental Leper. Racism is fundamentally a theory of history. It is a theory of who is who, of who belongs and who does not, of who deserves what and who is capable of what. By looking at racial categories and their fluidity over time, we glimpse the competing theories of history which informed the society and define its internal struggles. Matthew Fry Jacobson, Whiteness of a Different Color. We see the appearance of a state racism, a racism that society will direct against itself, against its own elements and its own products. This is the internal racism of permanent purification, and it will become one of the basic dimensions of social normalization. Michel Foucault, Society Must Be Defended. A mere surface examination of the communities suffering from environmental racism will reveal that they are the same communities who have lamented for generations that they have been systematically disenfranchised in all realms of society since they have stood on the shores of the United States. They are communities of color, African American, Native American, Hispanic, and Asian, and they are poor whites of native and immigrant stock who packed themselves into urban and rural settings that became environmentally marginalized with the rise of industrialization in the late 19th and 20th centuries. Some environmental scholars, and especially those tied to the modern environmental justice movement, like Robert Bullard, Beverly Wright, and Bunyan Bryant, have argued that environmental disenfranchisement of those communities stem from environmental racism, a term that for many lay people only connotes civil and social inequality and disenfranchisement as a function of race, primarily white versus non-white. This chapter seeks to respond to other environmental scholars in fields varying from economics to geology who have vehemently opposed the notion and or existence of environmental racism. Donald Kersey, an economist at the University of Chicago, has articulated that today's environmentally marginalized group voluntarily moved into neighborhoods that already had heavy industries and were heavily polluted before their arrival. Kersey and other scholars argue that environmentally marginalized groups are only marginalized because they choose to be. Other environmental economists have argued that these communities have become the geographical places that bear the environmental costs in the cost-benefit analysis equation for modern and postmodern industrialized society simply by chance. All of these scholarly discussions fail to recognize or acknowledge that the geographical and spatial restrictions placed on people of color and ethnic groups by residential bombings, restrictive covenants, redlining, and both private and public housing policies were organic societal techniques of discipline that led to forced segregation and eventually environmentally compromised and unsustainable communities for more than 2/3 of the 20th century. Urban historians, sociologists, and African American scholars have produced a voluminous amount of work that documents the austere and sometimes violent spatial and hence environmental segregation of African Americans after they came up from slavery and migrated into Americans' northern industrial cities. Examples include W.E.B. Du Bois, Philadelphia Negro, Alan Spears, Black Chicago, The Making of a Negro Ghetto Metropolis, Thomas Surge, The Origins of the Urban Crisis, Race and Inequality in Post-War Detroit, Douglas S. Massey and Nancy Denton's American Apartheid, Segregation and the Making of the Underclass, and Thomas Philpott's The Slum and the Ghetto, Neighborhood Deterioration and Middle Class Reform, Chicago, 1880 to 1930. No serious attempt at understanding the continued existence of environmentally unequal geographical spaces should dismiss these historical facts. It is how individuals are constructed and perceived by the larger body politic that will heavily determine the environmental space they occupy and their access to an environmentally sustainable community. Historically, however, the notion of race has never been a static concept in this country. It has been rapidly evolving since the end of the 19th century. Scholars like John Higman, David Roediger, Matthew Fry Jacobson, and Ian F. Haney Lopez, discussed below, have thoroughly elucidated the historical fact that many who are considered white today were not considered white in the last half of the 19th century and the first quarter of the 20th century. Even if they were considered white by some, they were classified as racially inferior whites. These classifications as inferior whites or non-whites resulted in the first examples of environmental racism. They were prevented from occupying sustainable geographical spaces, forced into living into ghettos, and if they were even allowed to work, they were forced into life-threatening jobs. In the packing houses industry, trimming work, which was specifically reserved for new immigrants. These trimming rooms were cold storage areas kept at near freezing temperatures with cold dripping water running along the walls and damp ice-cold floors. Many non-Western and racially marginalized immigrant groups would eventually become barred or limited from migrating into the United States. The connection between racism, white otherness, and geographical constriction has been clearly shown in labor historian David R. Roediger's The Wages of Whiteness, Race and the Making of the American Working Class, which focus on Irish immigrants. Roediger points out that the Irish did not ease into whiteness. They were initially classified by the U.S. Census Bureau as distinct from other native whites and foreigners. They were considered by influential social scientists like Herbert Spencer and Madison Grant, and prominent newspapers like the New York Times to be on a similar level of the racial evolutionary scale as blacks. This racial conceptualization of the Celts was belied by the natives' folk wisdom that held that an Irish man was a nigger inside out. The racism exhibited towards the Irish by native whites resulted in their sharing the same type of jobs in the domestic service and transportation industries as African Americans, and living side by side with them in the teeming slums of American cities. In his work, White by Law, The Legal Construction of Race, Ian F. Haney Lopez points out that both a scientific and common law understanding of racial distinctiveness eventually led to federal laws in the United States restricting immigration to the United States on the basis of race for nearly 100 years, roughly from the Chinese exclusion laws of the 1880s until the end of the national origins quotas in 1965. Between 1882 and 1917, Congress passed race-based restrictions on Chinese laborers. The first restriction came in 1882 with the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act, which resulted in a 10-year suspension on the immigration of Chinese labor immigration. This act was extended in 1884 and barred the laborers' immigration indefinitely. Finally, in 1917, an Asiatic bar zone was created, which excluded all Asian people. In addition to the race-based legal restriction of Chinese immigrants, in 1921, the U.S. government implemented a temporary quota system that severely restricted the immigration of racially undesirable Southern and Eastern Europeans. The temporary 1921 immigration restriction on Eastern and Southern Europeans eventually evolved into the 1924 National Origin Act. This bar on other Europeans was soon followed by the government's failed attempt to bar all black immigrants and immigrants of African descent, and its successful efforts to cause approximately 500,000 people to be forcibly returned to Mexico during the Depression, more than half of them U.S. citizens. These government attempts were partially successful in their race-based immigrant policies, that they were able to bar Asian immigrants but not immigrants of African descent. They were also able to successfully force Mexican immigrants, who were not considered at this time to be white, back to their native country. All of these disciplinary and segregating actions towards scientifically constructive racialized others resulted in them being forced into less than optimal environmental spaces. All of these immigrants were not banned, but those who were to remain in or enter the United States ended up living in areas like Chicago's back of the yards, whose abysmal living conditions were made famous by Upton Sinclair's The Jungle in 1906. From an environmental perspective, these others were being forced into less technologically developed societies, even as the United States was emerging as one of the leading modern industrialized societies. This was also the same time period in which the United States was creating a highly developed sanitary infrastructure and public health system for its rapidly expanding and industrialized cities to protect its citizenry from mortal epidemics like cholera, dysentery, and typhoid fever. The ousters of these others occurred during what environmental historian Martin Malosi has referred to as the bacteriological revolution of 1880 to 1945, a period that saw the development of modern sanitary services, when water supply, wastewater, and solid waste systems of this period were designed to provide permanent relief from threats to health. Although divergent in their explanations of how whiteness and concomitant white privilege emerged between 1840 and 1924, none of the aforementioned scholars have explicitly and specifically addressed the power and knowledge relationship between the social construction of whiteness and the access or lack of access to environmentally sustainable space as a function of race. Most of the scholarship in this area has tended to focus on the political and economic ramifications of being classified as non-white or inferior white. This chapter focuses on the void in the discussion on the history of environmental impacts, and specifically environmental racism, as a result of being non-white or an inferior white as defined by biologists, anthropologists, and social scientists. The phrase environmental racism, in its purest manifestation and conceptualization, derives from the Foucauldian power and knowledge relationship. The contemporary linguistic use of the term today, however, creates confusion. Environmental racism in the postmodern United States has come to imply the social and political disenfranchisement of blacks. In reality, however, the phenomenon actually embraces environmental disenfranchisement based upon multiple race categories, including whites, class, and ethnicity. Environmental scholars and future environmental policymakers need to reconcile the existence of environmental inequality with the historical fact that the communities who are today bearing the disproportionate costs of environmental pollution have or had a history of being constructed as racially inferior, whether they were white or non-white, in this country for several centuries, which resulted in being forced into unsustainable living spaces. The construction of varying degrees of racial inferiority, regardless of color, was supported and validated initially by European and American scientists who referred to themselves as social Darwinists and eugenicists at the end of the 19th century and the first 3 decades of the 20th century. These scientists and social scientists developed a paradigm of race and concomitant rights to American enfranchisement that became the operative and core episteme for determining the types of citizenry that would be entitled to salient green space into the 21st century. The vestiges of the historic national embrace of racial inferiority are the foundation for today's environmental inequality in marginalized communities. These communities are ones whose residents have suffered and continue to suffer disproportionately from environmental illnesses like asthma, lead poisoning, miscarriages, and chemically induced mental and learning disorders because their geographic spaces have been highly degraded and even poisoned from both legal and illegal waste management practices. The environmental integrity of these communities has also been tainted by the industrial, commercial, and retail operations, legally and illegally, allowed to exist in the same environmental spaces. No one seeks out these communities as ideal living spaces. Those living in these areas have had little luck escaping from them because of the body politic's historic view of them as undesirable people fit only to live in undesirable places. People who have been constructed by a larger body politic as being threats to the larger social body are usually the ones who end up living in these spaces: non-whites, the homeless, poor people, and the unemployed. So what was the role of the power and knowledge relationship between the tenets of social Darwinism, scientific racism, and eugenics at the end of the 19th century and during the first 3 decades of the 20th century in defining the relationship between government, the environment, and race?
All righty. Context of white supremacy. Got disconnected right as I was going to unmute my line. Whole computer froze and had to restart and everything. Made it back. Ready to roll. First audio session on Sylvia Hood Washington, her book Packing Them In. I had it right in front of me where we ended at in the first chapter, but I'm using the PDF of this one, so I'll have to give me a moment to get my screen open back up. In the meantime, glad we didn't have any difficulties, I don't believe, as we were broadcasting during the first audio segment. The number to dial if you have commentary, thoughts to share, 605-313-5164. The code 564-943 pound. Press star 61 if you would like to participate. All right, have my screen back. See if we can get things back together slowly. Number again, 605-313-5164. The code 564-943 pound. Press star 61 if you would like to participate. Where we stopped at, for me, it is on page 22, the subheading Social Darwinism, Eugenics, and the Birth of Environmental Others. This is a book, I will tell you immediately. I try to do this when we read books. I pay attention to the footnotes, and I encourage folks to do that as well. This book has the footnotes at the end of each chapter, so you don't have to keep flipping all the way back to the end of the text if you want to check them out. But 1, pay attention to the footnotes. 2, when we do books on the C.O.W.S, book club, or anywhere else, and there are a lot of references to former C.O.W.S guests, I try to call attention to that for a variety of reasons. If you want to go back in the archives, to let people be aware that, hey, Gus T, if he is, given a lot of props to this book, this is a great book, this is outstanding, that sort of thing, that, hey, Gus T could be doing some low-key bragging just because this is a book that mentions a lot of people that we've had on the program, that sort of thing. So just to be mindful, Matthew Fry Jacobson, guest on the program 2009, Ian Hani Lopez, in fact, part of the foundation, both of those guests were on the program 2009, the very year that we came back on the air, and we talked about the very books that Dr. Sylvia Hood Washington mentions, White by Law, and I have to go back, About Whiteness, Matthew Fry Jacobson, but they were both on the program. In fact, White by Law, very important book, talking about the history specifically of Supreme Court cases where they decided you would have a non-white person, they would change the classification, and they would go all the way to the Supreme Court and say, I'm classified as white, and they would go meet, and no, you're not, and this is the reason. Very important book, lots of information about racial classifications. I'll read in one of our listeners. They emailed commentary already about the book until Justice Edge got disconnected again. Thought I was going to read my email. Woo! So I dialed back in. I got disconnected twice just since the audio segment ended. Disconnected, I had to shut my computer down, all of that. I dialed back in to reconnect the second time, and I went just trying to get things shut down on my computer so I could just have the apps that I absolutely need opened, and shut down my dial-in app I was using to call in. Just chaos. All of that happens when you have disruptions. disruptions. Anyway, persevere. Lots of audio disturbances. I think listeners had reported that as well for a time. Even when I tried to call back in, I thought I was being fast and moving on the keyboard, and it wouldn't even reconnect me to the broadcast line. I had to dial in about 5 times. It might have been captured on the folks listening on the live stream. Anywho, the email. Person did their diligence before we even got started on Sylvia Hood Washington's Packing Them In. Email reads, number 1, the introduction suggests to me that the text may be geared more towards members of the Academy as opposed to the lay public. It has footnotes. I am interested to learn more about the concept of others and the philosopher Michael Foucault, since this is stated to be a central theme of the text. Number 2, the author states she intends to produce a history that reveals the agency of working class, minority groups, and women. I am interested to see how the author defines and demonstrates the agencies of so-called minority groups. Number 3, Chapter 1 discusses how the work of Charles Darwin and the theory of social Darwinism were used in forming the philosophy of white supremacy. Based on this theory, academic racists of the time expected impending extinction of the ex-slaves and their offspring after the Civil War, when reality proved that the former slaves were not dying out. Predictably, the academic racist did not conclude that they were deserving of help. The best policy towards them was no policy, or eugenics. Number 4, Chapter 1 describes the comprehensive and coordinated attack on black migrants by racist man and racist woman. With the surviving unfit, universities, religious institutions, settlement workers, and politicians all sought a solution to this impending American public health menace. Direct quote. Number 5, I would like to have had more information regarding the bombing of black-owned properties during the years 1917 through 1918 in Chicago. Warmth of Other Suns, Isabel Wilkerson. I'm afraid to open up my browser. I don't want anything else crazy to happen, but I suspect that that might be in Isabel Wilkerson's The Warmth of Other Suns. We read that in 2013. Well, disconnected again, switched. I'm glad I got through the email. I got disconnected again. Record for one program, I think. The Isabel Wilkerson, Warmth of Other Suns, the bombings in like 1917, 1918, around 1920. I suspect it's there. It's probably in a few other sources. If you gave me a moment to check, if I don't have any more disruptions and getting frozen computers and the rest of it. Anywho, we will get to the phone line and open up. I wish I'd opened the lines up before. That would have been one less task. Let's see if we can open up the folks who dialed in on the phone line. If you all have questions, comments to share, *61, number again, 605-313-5164. The code 564-943#. Press *61 if you would like to participate. Let's see. All right. Second or two, I'll get our switchboard here, and we'll nab folks who dialed in with a hand up. Woo! Much obliged for your patience, perseverance. Perseverance, that's what it is some days, especially with regards to counter-racism. *61 for folks who have thoughts. Thank you kindly to Henry in Chicago for doing the narration. It is a lot of hard work, I'll put it that way. It is a lot of time and energy to do the narration for books, so much obliged, Henry in Chicago. And make sure I get in for folks in the Chicago area. This is definitely a book that you should have in your archive. Super important. I recommend all the time that we make an effort to read about local history. If you are a Chicago native, native in the state of Illinois, you should definitely own this book, and particularly with all the talk they have about so-called environmental racism now. My goodness, and with the time period, history, not 1980s, 70s, definitely a book that you should have in the library. Let's see. While folks are getting their notes together, perhaps I'll be able to pull up my notes that I took from the first chapter. In addition to
the immediate, for me at least, standing out, the number of different authors that have already been guests on the program. I kind of appreciate her laying out the roadmap of why she did this text and some of the things that are important in her understanding of racism, white supremacy. One of the main things that she states at the very beginning in terms of looking at the term environmental racism, right? Environmental racism and then environmental justice. She talked about, we talk about that as well. They'll move away from, they'll say social justice and things of that nature. But even environmental racism, where she makes it primary at the beginning, that you have individuals who were not classified as white previously, who were subjected to these same poisonous environmental standards, but then maybe later on they do become accepted as white, and so they can, move to different areas, or maybe they're still stuck in the same area, but that it has not been linear. While I think that's important, and it's true, like I said, we've had some of the very scholars that she references there have been guests on this program, so certainly that is true. You can be classified as white. You can be reclassified. Maybe you were accepted as white at one point, and then maybe you messed up or did something, and now you're kicked off of the team, the race, so to speak. But I think, at least for me, any groups of people, you are high enough on the scale of white supremacy. It is a hierarchy. Black get back, yellow mellow, brown stick around, white is right. We've heard that before. If that is the case, and I believe the evidence suggests it absolutely is worldwide, if you are in a group where you are melanin deficient enough that at some point you or your offspring, you all can actually move out of the black classification. You don't have to be confined to the Negro part of town. You can marry a white person or move out, get a job, all that sort of thing. I think that's very different. That's the way I try to talk about white supremacy, racism on this program consistently, in terms of not lumping poor white people. Well, because she mentioned the apple, I got to get the apple. Not lumping poor white people in with the way that black people, even non-white people in general, are treated. And even some of the evidence that we had information in the book that we just finished, Harriet A. Washington, A Terrible Thing to Waste, she said the same thing, that in terms of what I'm saying, that poor white people are not, she said that repeatedly, poor white people are not treated the same way as black people. In fact, she had flagrant statistics about how poor white people, they do not get the same type of poisons and toxins dumped in their areas as so-called middle-class black people. She had repeated statistics in A Terrible Thing to Waste talking about this, and I think she even had some information about that in Medical Apartheid. But that's, point of contention. We'll have to investigate that as we move through the book, see how much, that comes up in the text to begin with. I was a little confused when she was in her introduction phase, and she was talking about grew up in Cleveland. She was talking about the first black mayor there, Carl Stokes. So I got a little thrown off at first because I was thinking Chicago, and then she switched to Cleveland, but I appreciated the fact that it's so consistent in terms of the terrorism and the tactics that white people use to mistreat and, in this case, poison black people, that it sounded so familiar when she was going around and collecting these memories of pollution and terrorism from different black people. And it sounded so familiar, even though this book is focused on Chicago. She grew up in Cleveland. She's like, oh, man, that sounds like the exact same thing, and going to these really toxic work environments and just trying to do the best that you can for your family, and them dumping stuff in the area, and something is wrong with it, and that's sort of like consistent. It's not just Flint, not a new thing, long-running system of racism, white supremacy. I believe there was a good chunk of victim blaming in the text. She talked about how some these white authors, they would talk about environmental racism and Chicago specifically, and say, well, hey, this area was polluted way before these Negroes got here. This is not like we just started dumping because Negroes moved here. This area has been bad forever, and in fact, the Negroes, they are so ignorant to do any research, they couldn't get online and check out where they're moving to. Well, then tough titty. That's on them. That's their fault. They should have been more knowledgeable consumers before they checked out an area. I appreciate her taking the time to kind of debunk that, and that's exactly what we just heard. You see the continuity in the text, blaming the victim. That was all throughout a terrible thing to waste. It's black people's fault about the lead abatement, that you got lead in your house. You just didn't learn how to use spick and span properly, or you don't vacuum, or whatever the excuse will be, that you don't tidy, so it's your fault. Same thing here, blaming the victim. She mentioned it in a lot of different ways. It wasn't just lead. It was repeatedly black people being blamed for eating bad food or whatever it's going to be. It's your fault that this is happening. Again, the parallels between this book and what we just finished, Harriet A. Washington, Dr. Hood, she kind of she explicitly states that the racism, there is a science, so-called pseudoscience, one might say, undergirding all of this, justifying. She talks about the eugenics, and we heard all of that was right at the very beginning of a terrible thing to waste, and medical apartheid, where she lays that foundation for this frame of thought about who is even fit to survive. She talked about Charles, who is even fit to survive on the planet, and all that talk about black people being feeble-mindedness. We don't want them out here reproducing. We don't want any of these criminals, super predators, even though, it's the same thought process. We talked about that in Uyghur, same thing, thought process, even though you might put a different term on it or what have you, depending on the time period, but the same thought process. We got to do something. They got to be controlled. We don't want this to get out of hand, Negro reproduction to run amok. Appreciated that scientific undergirding. Again, not just poor white people, and again, she talked about how this is federal. This is all levels of participation in terms of white people working together as a unit to practice white supremacy racism. Let's see. Before I get the rest of my notes, number again, 605-313-5164, the code 564-943#. Press star 61 if you would like to participate. I think it's super important, her laying out at the beginning that many times the environmental racism, the books, the text, that it focuses exclusively on white people, their participation, white women, what they call more affluent white people, whatever that means, and what they have done to focus attention, certainly, more of the younger white people that are engaged in this now and willing to go out and protest the pipeline, Trans-Pacific pipeline, or, all of whatever else they're upset about. No styrofoam. That's what we here in Seattle. We can't have styrofoam cups, can't get bags at the grocery store. They don't even do plastic straws. Outrage. And saying that this often ignores, I would say predictably, routinely ignores the history of black people, non-white people participating in these movements for years, decades before any of these folks were born, that they were knowledgeable, that they were not just ignorant dupes about what was happening to them, that they may have been in a reduced power position, and I appreciate her use of the word power. She did say white privilege a few times, but power, that the black people, victims of racism, may have had less power, but they still did what they could from a weak power position, which is what I do. That's what all of us do, to try to call attention that this was happening, that they were being poisoned, and then to try to get this stopped as best they could. Super important, and I think that's consistent, where they'll just erase, obfuscate, and make it seem like white people are the only ones that have been involved with this, or the only ones that are concerned about this, and that way they also get to totally obfuscate the racism aspect of it. They'll come up with terms like environmental justice and things of that nature. Let's see. I thought it was interesting. I had to go back. I got confused when she was talking about Cleveland. She said that they were upset. They had the first black mayor, Carl Stokes, and that black people in Cleveland were upset that he was practicing environmental racism with, what was allowed to be dumped in the areas where black people lived. And he countercharged that they were the ones who were racist because they did not want to go through with his initiatives to get better housing for the black people. And I just said, oh, I told you I was already confused because I was like, Cleveland, I thought this was about Chicago. And it's like, oh, okay, this is just her quick, reminiscence about her childhood, and it's the same thing. Got it, okay. But then when I got there, like I said, I was confused at first. Like, dude, what? Carl Stokes I thought he's black. He is black. Number one, the racial showcasing. In the system of white supremacy, it is standard operating procedure to have, and the first black mayor, no less, to have a black person. We'll put them up there, and then they'll be the ones that'll get blamed, particularly from mayor, like they have that much power to do anything or to get whatever stopped, especially if it's a black person. Like Mr. Stokes, former Mayor Stokes, like he has the ability to stop anything. You're not going to dump that dirt in this area. You're not going to put that landfill here. I mean, from a weak power position, the most he can do is go talk to these white people, And it might be, hey, they might tell him the same thing. This is what it's going to be, nigger. Mayor nigger. This is what it's going to be. But stunning, the system of racism, white supremacy can create those sort of scenarios on a regular basis where we end up in conflict with each other and the whites just get to sit around and crack up laughing about all of this. If we have any folks who live in the Cleveland area, if you remember this, feel free to share. Not, you don't have to be paying attention to all that, but I did think that was fascinating. Let's see. She named a number of books, most of them I never heard of, except for Dumping in Dixie. Dr. Bullard, that was mentioned repeatedly in A Terrible Thing to Waste. Maybe we should get Dr. Bullard on the program. He has a lot of books about racism, white supremacy. I think he's still down in the Houston, Texas area. Folks want to do more reading on the subject matter. Dr. Hood, she hooked us up in the first show. We haven't even got that far in the text, and she has hooked us up already. Let's see. I'll give out one more, and then I'll double-check, see if folks have any thoughts, observations. Again, much obliged for your patience. Had so many disruptions. I want to try to get the audio rolling here. Let's see. One other note from the first portion. Yeah, this was another one. She said this is still in the introduction. This is from me on page 2 from the introduction. She says the primary historical difference from an environmental perspective between people of color, especially African Americans, and white ethnic groups is that their environmentally marginalized geographical spaces were constructed by more rigid and longer-lasting race-based legal decisions and public policies that were sanctioned and endorsed by government at all levels. That is substantial, in my opinion, substantial enough that I would not say it's comparable if we're talking about so-called Irish or other so-called ethnic groups who are now accepted as white. If you did not have government, legal sanctioned white terrorism, chemical biological warfare that was in a very rigid fashion erected against you for generations, and again, where you've been able to move out. We talked about that last week or with the last book, A Terrible Thing to Waste, where if you're subjected to these toxins, which everyone is to some degree, if you are classified as white and you have access where you can go and get healthy foods that nourish your body and help get rid of some of those toxins. If you can do that, and if you live in an environment where you're not saturated with all these toxins and you have the money to get the really nice, super efficient water filter in your residence, and you can get all the organic produce so you don't get any of those extra toxins, and you can get the test strips to test your water, and you have a HEPA filter on your vacuum cleaner and a HEPA air filter in your residence, well then, hey, you can mitigate greatly some of these circumstances. If you are a black person, it's going to be substantially more difficult, and you're probably going to be subjected to much more toxins, pollutions, and many more environments where you work, where you live, etc., and the epigenetic factor, your parents, and all that. So, yeah, the same thing I said before. I don't think it's the same comparing so-called white ethnics or former white ethnics to black people. Anywho, number again, 605-313-5164, the code 564943 #. press star 61 if you have thoughts, questions to share. The person who wrote in and said that they thought the book may cater to more of an academic reading audience. Again, now it has footnotes. That doesn't necessarily mean that, you know, lay people don't read books with footnotes, but the white-dominated academies, they're going to want footnotes, particularly if this is a black person, Dr. Hood is a black female, they're going to want footnotes to make sure that you're not just running off at the mouth, and probably some footnotes of some white authors to substantiate what you have to say. Michael Foucault is a French author, white male French author who is very popular with the college kids. If you go, and I would say particularly folks who do like English, philosophy, there are probably some other doctrines, but anything where you have to do like a lot of like reading and socio-political writing, oh yeah, you're going to have to read some Foucault. He's come up many, many times in talking about racism, white supremacy, particularly when I was on college campuses. So I'd say coming out with Foucault so early, and a number of the footnotes that you've already heard, Ian Hani Lopez and Matthew Fry Jacobson, I would say those are more academic texts. Ian Hani Lopez, his book is all about Supreme Court cases. So, I mean, I would encourage listeners, read that book. You can go back in the archives and hear when he was on the program, August 2009. But, again, that's like a law book, basically. I would think like law people who are like maybe law students who study race and law would have to read that, like would be required reading to do like something that's studying the history of Supreme Court cases and racial classification. So absolutely, this is not a book intended for so-called lay people, even though I think it's important to read, especially if you're in Chicago. Thomas in New York, did you have thoughts, observations?
Good evening, Gus. Good evening to all the callers. Yeah, I did have one observation I made from the book thus far, is the author uses the body politic. And I'm wondering, I mean, is that just a way to say the white supremacists? The way that the author uses it, it's like people in charge, you know, the people with power. It doesn't seem like she's talking about black people. I think it's a female author who's talking about black people, but I could be wrong. But that the body politic is. Do you get that from that? It means the white supremacists. Hello?
Yes, sir. I switched back.
I'm sorry.
No apologies. I was able to switch back, see if things will cooperate for a time. So the term body politic, it's always difficult. You know, maybe we can get her. I had said that perhaps we can get her on the program. We can ask specifically. I always like to ask the person who uses the term. That's the best according to code. I generally hear the word body politique used when sometimes they'll just be talking about everyone, meaning they'll be talking about all the citizens of a particular so-called country. So if they were going to say the body politic, they might be talking about all of the individuals, the entire population in the United States. The way that she's using it here, you said you feel like she's using it to mean white people specifically, yes?
Oh, yes, because in one of the ways she used it, if I'm not mistaken, and I don't have the book, is that like the body politic, they look at black people, non-white people, I think she used, and women, and you know, in a certain way. So it seemed to me like the majority, or you know, the dominant society. You know what I mean?
I'll have to pay attention to when that phrase, I'll see if I can scroll back through and find specific sentences where she uses that phrasing, because I'm looking at the dictionary definition for body politique is the people of a nation, state, or society considered collectively as an organized group of citizens. So that's what I said. That's like everybody, all of the citizens in that particular so-called country, that would be everybody, the body politique. But here, it's seeming like if we're talking about the people who really count when it comes to decision making and whether you're going to have, a toxic landfill next to your school, that body politique, those would be people classified as white, absolutely.
Yeah, I got you. No, I'm just waiting for the book to heat up a little. I was getting the backstory, and so I'm just waiting for her to definitely get into this Darwinism part, because I kind of agree with that. If she's using the theory, the same way I do, I kind of agree with that being the base point of white supremacists. Eugenics, sciences, their philosophies, all of it is based off of the fact that, we're some monkey people and they're, Homo sapiens sapiens. They're more sophisticated, chosen, selected. I believe it's the word Darwin used, selection. So, I'm just waiting for that part, guys. And I think a great follow-up book to the last one, for sure.
That's what I was thinking, that, this is, not that, it can't be random. We could have read some fiction or what have you. 48 Laws of Power, that's been high on the selection list from a lot of other listeners have wanted to read that one for a while, which we certainly will get to, hopefully, soon. But I thought, see, lots of folks. And I'm in agreement. I'm totally down. I had it. I've just been procrastinating for whatever reason. But Robert Greene, 48 Laws of Power, should be coming to the cows. We should get that out of the way 2020 because we have been holding off on that one for a long time. But yes, I too am looking to getting a little further in the book. I thought this would be a great follow to Harriet A. Washington. If you listen chronologically, let's see, Henry in Chicago. Much obliged again for doing the heavy lifting of the reading. So glad I don't have to narrate. Whoopee. Any thoughts, observations from the first portion of the reading?
Can I be heard? Hello?
I hear you. Yes, sir.
Oh, okay. I actually appreciated her kind of defining this thing where there was, like she had the phrase environmental justice, and she basically plain and said that environmental racism was kind of a more accurate term of it, and how she kind of breaks down the history of racism. Now, it is true that, Eastern Europeans who migrated here in the late 19th and 20th century were not classified as white. But I don't think we got to that part of the book where she also states that eventually they got, migrated into the white society, and kind of like blacks were left on the outside and still getting, environmentally terrorized. She has the name, she used the name of a prominent racist sociologist. I noticed one that we've talked about before, Madison Grant. I'm actually surprised she didn't reference Lopper Stoddard in this one as well. Typically, when I see Madison Grant, Lopper Stoddard is like not far behind, but she has a number of racist, racist sociologists, including Darwin. So that, he's like one of the top racist sociologists. So I'm actually surprised she didn't, or maybe later on in the book she'll mention him. I don't know. And she also mentioned, and it's probably going to be prominent in the book, the Altgeld Gardens. What's so interesting about the Altgeld Gardens is that it's an area where majority of black people live, where it's off of the I-57 expressway, and it has so many trash dumps and landfills over there. if you drive by the expressway, if you drive by that part of the expressway during the summertime, you can literally smell the garbage. I mean, every time I drive by there, it's like, sometimes you have to just roll your window up because it will really, really put a smell in your car. And that has been going on for decades, probably almost a century, But as long as I've been in Chicago, I've always remembered that area, especially during the summertime, since the garbage gets hot, just very much intense. And I just couldn't imagine, what the people, living there have to go through, during that time. And obviously, it's on the south side of Chicago. So it's, where, predominantly, non-white black people live at. So, and then, with the back of the yards, they had the stockyards, but they eventually closed those in the 70s. But now you notice that the quote-unquote Eastern Europeans don't live there anymore. Now it's predominantly Mexican now over in that area of Chicago. I think I'll stop there and I'll just mute my line.
The so-called Eastern Europeans probably able to be accepted as white at some point, or at least far enough black get back. Yellow mellow, brown stick around. Eastern European, you get rid of that accent. We talked about all this. Matthew Fry Jacobson. He talked about all the little steps that you can do. You change that name up, get rid of that accent, maybe get, dye the head, depends, what's going on with the hair. But, oh, yeah, maybe in the same generation, certainly by one generation, you make sure you don't have offspring with someone too dark. You can move away from all that. And think about that, for having to live in that sort of environment where it's not just, oh, my gosh, roll the window up. Ugh, let's wait 5 minutes and then, oh, okay, we got fresh air again. Think about that. You live here. You have to have children here with all that we heard over the last, I was going to say last week, but I mean, last few weeks that we were reading A Terrible Thing to Waste. You're trying to have children here. How does that impact your offspring? Where this is not 5 minutes of just driving through. This is every day. I sleep and breathe this. I wake up in the morning and breathe this. Try to get some exercise. Imagine you try to go outside, as a child. That's what they say. Go outside, get some exercise. You can't just stay in the house. Go outside. That's what you got to breathe. Not by accident. Any other observations, questions, thoughts? Folks want to make sure they get in before. Oh, yep. Let's see. Retired firefighter, did you have questions, observations? You should be with us, sir.
Yes. Looking forward to the reading of the book. It seems like the author is going to be very scientific in her analysis of these problems. Already what I'm hearing is how she is accentuating accuracy when it comes to racism and the quote-unquote term that's called ethnic. She makes it difficult for white people to state, well, we had the same, the white people who call themselves Irish or some other group that at one time was not classified as white, but the intent of the races was to maneuver them into being on the quote-unquote team for a purpose. And I'm looking forward to more of this examination that she's utilizing because it's very important, especially for non-white people to read this in books. A total scientific breakdown, so we can get a clear understanding of the global system of racism, white supremacy. And in this term, she's talking about environmental form of racism. Very, very, very important to break things down to that particular level. And I have a lot more to say, but I know you're on time as far as getting into the next readings. So go ahead. Thank you.
If you had additional thoughts, you can make a note. We should have ample time once the second audio segment concludes. Whiteness of a Different Color. That's it. Matthew Fry Jacobson, and that's the book we discussed on the program, September 2009. And in fact, Matthew Fry Jacobson was here at Seattle. That's why I said a lot of the universities, they'll have, speakers, authors, they'll come and give a talk on racism or what environmental racism, whatever it is. He came here to discuss his book and racism, and I was able to ask him some questions. We talked about it, I think, back on the – it was the same day as a totally different and unrelated broadcast. I think I kind of mentioned it as an aside, but I wish I had recorded that exchange. Justice was there. Back of the Bus was there. We had a number of victims. Some other Cows listeners were present. It was fascinating. Matthew Fry Jacobson, suspected race soldier. You can go back in the archives. Anywho, second audio segment will get started. She is beginning the subsection Social Darwinism, Eugenics, and the Birth of Environmental Others. Context of White Supremacy. This is audio segment number 2.
Social Darwinism, Eugenics, and the Birth of Environmental Others. In his seminal work, Race, the History of an Idea in America, Thomas Gossett summarized the basic tenets of social Darwinism. First, that societies and their institutions slowly evolve. Second, that no society could change beyond the point where evolution had brought it, and that any attempt to change it would produce disastrous results. And third, that heredity, in this case race, was the primary factor in determining how far a society had and would evolve. For social Darwinists, the ideal of natural selection was translated into a struggle between individual members of a society, between members of classes of a society, between different nations, and between men. Far from being evil, this natural conflict was nature's indispensable method for producing superior men, superior nations, and superior races. The chief and most influential person in the theoretical development of social Darwinism during this time was the 19th century British philosopher, sociologist, and scientist Herbert Spencer, 1820 to 1903. Spencer's reputation at the time rivaled that of Charles Darwin. Spencer was best known for developing and applying evolutionary theory to philosophy, psychology, and the study of society, what he calls his synthetic philosophy. It was Spencer who coined the two terms associated with human evolution, the struggle for existence and the survival of the fittest. He also developed the paradigm of the slow evolution of society akin to biological evolution that should not be artificially interfered with. The environmental consequences for the unfit are apparent when one takes into account that Spencer was an avid proponent of the laissez-faire, who was opposed to sanitation laws, public education, free libraries, and the licensing of medical doctors and nurses. Spencer's ideal society was one that had no social legislation, no regulation of industry, and no assisted relief for the poor. It would be a society that will allow natural selection to occur by doing nothing for primitive and lesser people. He was also a strong advocate for the eugenic effects of war, which acted to eliminate inferior people. Spencer heavily influenced the field of American sociology and most of the people who took up the study of sociology in this country between 1870 and 1890 were drawn to the subject by Spencer's writings. Spencer's chief American disciple was the highly influential Yale University professor of political science and sociologist William Graham Sumner. Sumner was also an adamant supporter of laissez-faire, who opposed public education, poor laws, and labor laws regulating hours and working conditions in factories. The environmental consequences of laissez-faire and social Darwinist thought would be that those already marked as being outside of the pale of the social body were not to be assisted by the government. If the unfit could not remedy the environmental problems of their marginalized geographical spaces themselves, they would suffer the natural consequences of their condition: disease, mortality, and eventual extinction. This mentality would explain why sanitary infrastructures built at the turn of the century usually benefited primarily the native white communities. Racist, nativist thought during this time period was also boosted by the emergence of the eugenics movement led by British psychologist and anthropologist Sir Francis Galton, a cousin of Charles Darwin. It was Galton who would coin the term eugenics and nature and nurture and develop the first intelligence tests. Galton believed that there was not merely grades of men within races, but also grades of races, and that primitive races, and not just non-whites, were inferior. Unlike social Darwinists, eugenicists believed in government intervention that would act to discourage the reproduction and proliferation of inferior races within the body politic and social body of a state. American eugenicist G. Stanley Hall ridiculed reform but advocated government support of the sterilization and segregation of the unfit. Both social Darwinists and eugenicists felt that the poor's environmental conditions stemmed from their own inferiority. This sentiment was shared by historian contemporary Stanford University President David Starr Jordan, who stated that poverty, dirt, and crime are due to poor human material. In Whiteness of a Different Color, historian Matthew Fry Jacobson points out that racial categorization in the 19th and 20th centuries was based on the development of otherness, abnormality, as it relates to the normal and superior true American, the Anglo-Saxon. Jacobson points out in his history of racial evolution that the period of mass European immigration from the 1840s to the restrictive legislation of 1924, Johnson-Reed Act, also known as the National Origins Act, witnessed a fracturing of whiteness into a hierarchy of plural and scientifically determined white races. Jacobson's conclusions are consistent with those of the seminal immigration historian John Hyman in Strangers in the Land, Patterns of American Nativism, 1860 to 1925. The thrust of John Hyman's work was that Anglo-Saxon nativism in the last decade of the 19th century was compounded by imperialism and an emerging ideology of scientific racism. This thought was embraced by such influential upper-class Yankee intellectuals in the American mainstream as Kentucky-born Harvard geologist Nathan S. Schaller, who was the head of the Lawrence Scientific School, Harvard-educated political scientist and statesman Henry Cabot Lodge, and Massachusetts Institute of Technology economist Francis A. Walker. Hyman points out that by the mid-1890s, both Schaller and Lodge arrived at the same conclusion. Instead of indicting the immigrants as a whole, they now drew a sharp racial contrast between Northwestern and Southeastern Europeans, maintaining that the new non-Aryan peoples were wholly different from earlier immigrants and innately impossible to Americanize. For Hyman, Lodge was the most extreme and influential of the three intellectuals, someone who was exceptional both in his direct contact with European race thinking and in the degree to which he embraced an ideal of racial purity. It was Lodge who tried to persuade his fellow U.S. statesmen about the perils of non-Aryan immigration. Lodge based his logic on the racist ideologies of such European scholars as Gustavus Le Bon, who argued that crossbreeding among the races, ethnic groups, would prevent a nation from achieving its full destiny. Francis Walker, a superintendent of the U.S. Census in 1870, was more concerned about the birth rate of foreigners in the country and the concomitant potential for biological defeat of native Aryan stock. Hyman points out that it was Walker who counteracted the positivist Darwinian notion by declaring that the natural selection was now working in reverse due to the cheapness and ease of steam transportation. The fittest now stay at home, the unfit migrate. Walker's scientific naturalism argued that the rapid birth rate of unfit, non-Aryan immigrants would lead to the extinction of the native Aryan stock. Lodge, Walker, and Schaller all influenced the nativist and racist immigration policies that emerged during this time frame. Their views represented the power-knowledge relationship articulated by Foucault in describing how power is exerted in a modern society based upon race. In 1976, Foucault postulated that the discourse of race struggle will become the discourse of a centered, centralizing power. It will become the discourse of a battle that has to be waged not between races, but by a race that is portrayed as the one true race, the race that holds power and is entitled to define the norm, and against those who pose a threat to the biological heritage. All three of these intellectuals' ideologies are consistent with the Foucauldian notion that government was responsible for protecting the larger body from biological threats, which, in this case, were other whites who needed to be separated and quarantined from the large native white body. As a result, non-Aryan immigrant stock would end up voluntarily, by self-discipline, and involuntarily occupying environmentally compromised geographical spaces, in other words, slums and ghettos, in American cities because of the nativist and racist hostilities from native white Americans. Historian John S. Holler Jr. concurs with the historians cited above. For Holler, the men responsible for transferring these early notions of scientific racism were Herbert Spencer, John Wesley Powell, Edward Drinker Cope, Frederick Hoffman, Joseph LeConte, and Nathan S. Schaller. The majority of these men were highly respected scientists, intellectuals who publicly articulated ideologies about race deeply influenced the social construction of others within American society who would come to be socially, politically, and environmentally disenfranchised because they were thought to be outside the pale of the American social body. These others were the same non-Aryan people described above. The majority were of African descent. The scientific ideologies of these men also contributed to race-based restrictive immigration laws and nationally embraced segregation policies. Most of these men were Spencerian social Darwinists or neo-Lamarckians, who believed that environmental influences as a means to uplift a race were not beneficial for non-Aryan people. Holler's study also supported Foucault's thesis that power and knowledge are codependent and mutually generative. In this case, science became an instrument which verified the presumptive inferiority of the Negro and rationalized the politics of disenfranchisement and segregation into the social scientific terminology that satisfied the troubled conscience of the middle class. The Lamarckian racial view of University of Pennsylvania's paleontologist Edward Drinker Cope was similar to that of Schaller, an American-trained physician and evolutionary idealist Joseph Leconte. Leconte was of French Huguenot descent, the son of scientist Louis Leconte, a student of Louis Agassiz, and an avid disciple of Herbert Spencer. Leconte believed that the Negro race has evolved as far as possible under slavery, and that whites would need to maintain some type of control over the Negro because of his inability to care for himself in freedom, and because race struggle and the increased energy of civilization appeared to threaten his survival. This ideology would dominate national thought about the assimilative capacity of blacks in the larger social body into the 21st century. Despite being freed from slavery, African Americans have carried the racial stigmas originally articulated by these scientifically endorsed ideologies the longest. Even today, blacks, as the penultimate social others, continue to suffer disproportionately from environmental policies. As pointed out by scholars David Roediger and Matthew Fry Jacobson, previously defined non-Aryan European immigrants would eventually become absorbed into the larger white social body and cease to be thought of as others by the late 1920s. At the very least, they ceased to being thought of as a separate racial group. Their ability to access sustainable living spaces was a direct benefit of this development. This has not been the case for blacks. A significant part of this chapter, therefore, concentrates on blacks' history as the ultimate environmental lepers in modern and postmodern society. The discussion uses the most racially segregated city in America, Chicago, as its historical reference point for discussion because its past and recent racial and environmental history provides an ideal Foucauldian paradigm of power and knowledge relationships. Despite the mid-century civil rights movement and the environmental justice movement, the majority of Chicago blacks still live in highly racially segregated communities that carry a disproportionate amount of environmental waste disposal facilities. Environmental sociologist Robert D. Bullard has indicated that 92% of Chicago's 1.1 million blacks live in racially segregated communities. Chicago is also the home of one of the most egregious environmental toxic communities in the United States, Altgeld Gardens. The gardens have over 50 active or closed commercial hazardous waste landfills, 100 factories, including 7 chemical plants and 5 steel mills, and 103 abandoned waste dumps. It is also inhabited by a large African American population. Blacks, the interminable environmental others. Urban black communities that formed in the North during the 2 great migration periods had sought out a Mecca and a promised land articulated by industrial boosters, the black media, and black social and political organizations. Their presence created concerns among the northern white body politic, who regarded them as a black plague and black menace. In response, these communities were forced to settle into highly segregated and environmentally degraded environments near industrial facilities. These factors, coupled with little or no sanitary infrastructures, created a public health problem for black migrating communities. For the more conservative members of American society, this was perceived as a solution to the larger public health problem. The perception and treatment of blacks under segregationist policies fits Mary Povey's thesis of the construction of social bodies by those in power in order to isolate a segment of the larger society with the ultimate objectives of managing, manipulating, and controlling them. Povey argues in The Making of a Social Body, British Cultural Formation, that Victorian British society developed the cultural concept of the social body to refer to its isolated poor citizenry. According to Povey, this development allowed social analysis to treat one segment of the population as a special problem at the same time they could gesture towards the mutual interests that, theoretically, united all parts of the whole. This cultural development led to the concept of pauperism. According to Povey, pauperism was a moral and physical designation which encompassed all of the components eventually regulated to the social domain: criminal tendencies, bodily health, environmental conditions, education, and religion. More so than the Victorian English poor, African Americans living in Chicago throughout the migration period were highly visible and thought of as being a diseased segment of the larger social body and body politic. The aggressive actions by the larger white social body to keep them essentially spatially and environmentally quarantined would lead to violence in the form of race riots and bombings, and eventually to a de facto segregation. This perception of blacks as the ultimate social undesirables and others can be seen in the following contemporary news headlines, which address the black migration into Chicago during the first Great Migration. 500,000 darkies from the Dixie swarmed to the north to better themselves. Rush of Negroes to city starts health inquiry. Philadelphia warns of Pearl, health. Police heads to act. Negroes arrive by thousands. Pearl to health. Big influx of laborers offer vital housing problem to city. Defense Board warned against Negro influx. Investigators see pearls such as resulted in East St. Louis. Negro influx brings disease. Health Commissioner orders vaccination of arrivals to check smallpox. Darwinism and public health implications for blacks. In the wake of emancipation, blacks would face the insidious impacts of scientific racism articulated by social Darwinists who helped facilitate the acceptance of scientific racism. The publication of Darwin's Origin of Species in 1859 re-energized racist philosophies about black inferiority and the support of social, political, and economic disenfranchisement. There was a wide acceptance of Darwinist-based ideologies, such as that of Herbert Spencer, who advanced the notion that blacks, non-whites, and other whites belong to unfit races that would not survive in the emerging modern society. For several decades following emancipation, there was a prevalent ideology among both northern and southern whites that blacks, after having made their artificial exodus from slavery, were doomed to extinction because of their intellectual inferiority and their physical constitution. This point of the widely held societal view of impending black extinction is made in George M. Fredrickson's study, The Black Image in the White Mind, The Debate of Afro-American Character and Destiny, 1897 to 1914. Fredrickson points out that even Reconstructionists like novelist and freedman bureaucrat from 1866 to 1868, John W. DeForest, publicly articulated the view that the Negro, no matter how well educated, is not the mental equal of the European and will surely pass into sure and deserved oblivion. This perception of the impending demise of African Americans was shared by Europeans like geologist August Legal, who, although in favor of constitutional amendments guaranteeing black equality, felt that the days of the black race are numbered and fatal laws condemn it to die out, or rather be transformed. French journalist Georges Clemenceau wrote in 1869 that the black man would never be able to successfully compete with the white man, and that he was fated to be the victim of that natural selection which is constantly operating under our eyes in spite of everything, and he must eventually go under in the more or less distant future. The 1870 U.S. Census, the first after emancipation, provided support to some in the belief of impending extinction for blacks because it supposedly showed that the population rate for blacks had declined since slavery and was only 50% of the rate for whites. This prediction of impending extinction would be overturned by the 1880 census, which showed that the population rate for Southern blacks was much larger than that of their white counterparts. The results and interpretations of the census data varied from 1870 to the turn of the century. But all in all, the concept of impending black extinction remained at the forefront of the discussion among scientists, medical doctors, politicians, novelists, and journalists. German-born insurance statistician Frederick L. Hoffman's 1896 book, Race, Traits, and Tendencies of the American Negro, had enormous influence in convincing white insurance companies of the folly of providing insurance coverage to blacks. Hoffman's book was written in the tone of the prevailing social Darwinist philosophy. He argued that black extinction was taking place because of race traits and tendencies that resulted in the proliferation of disease among blacks that had little or nothing to do with environmental factors, but was due in large part to their own indigenous immorality. According to Hoffman, the Negro had begun to degenerate after emancipation, and the tendency of the race has been downward and will lead to a still greater mortality, a lesser degree of economic and social efficiency, a lower standard of nurture, and a diminishing excess of births over deaths, and in the end cause the extinction of the race. Hoffman's work was strongly supported by University of Virginia medical professor and chairman of the facility, Dr. Paul A. Barringer. In his book, The American Negro, His Past and Future, Barringer made the social Darwinist argument that any social problem that the Negro was encountering were rooted in his own biological inferiority and were an indication that he was, in actuality, reverting to his natural primitive savage state. The dogma on biological destiny elucidated by Hoffman and Barringer's work was soon joined by historian Joseph A. Tillinghast in his study, The Negro in Africa and America. The argument set forth in Tillinghast's book was that blacks had evolved in the hot climates of Africa with a long history of cannibalism, ignorance, and immorality. According to Tillinghast, the New World will deal a mortal blow to this community because of the coldness of the climate and the structure and demands of a more advanced and civilized society. Public health for the Negro was oxymoronic under the paradigm of social Darwinism, since the best public policy was no policy, a concept that cooperated with nature's tendency to eliminate the unfit.
Context of White Supremacy. I thought she said Jeffrey Dahmer. I got confused. They started talking about cannibals. And don't you think Gus T. Renegade has been oblivious to the shooting in Wisconsin? Man, I was wishing it was the old days when workplace racism was on Thursday and the book club was on Friday. We would have been right there. Tomorrow, we will have more information. I've been writing about it on social media. Neutralizing workplace racism comes on every week for a reason. There's a lot of attention in Milwaukee, Wisconsin right now. Workplace racism, another shooting. We'll talk about that tomorrow. I thought I was all slick, had got my audio together for tomorrow, and then all of this happened, so I have to switch things up a little bit. But all of that to say, Wisconsin, long record of abusing black people. This here book is about Chicago, but they got to talking about cannibals at the end. I said, Jeffrey Dahmer? What? Oh, they were talking about something else. I thought they... Woo! We will pick this up next week. We're still very early in the book. Sylvia Hood Washington, black female author, and I think she is a certified yoga instructor. I didn't find that out until like a couple days ago. Packing Them In, an archaeology of environmental racism in Chicago, 1865 to 1954. The number is 605-313-5164. The code 564943 pound. Press star 61 if you would like to participate. Much obliged again for your patience. Audio difficulties. No easy victories. Expect massive interference from race soldiers. All the folks who dialed in before, if you have commentary to share, line should be open. Thomas in New York, Henry in Chicago, our narrator. Retired firefighter. If other folks are with us, if you have thoughts, observations to share, make sure you do not wait until the last moment. Go ahead and get your hand up. We'll make sure we get you on the line. If you are a resident of the Illinois area and or if you grew up in Chicago, really if you have relatives, people that you care about who live in the Chicago area, should probably nab this book. Seems like it'll probably have some really good information. I didn't even get to check the footnotes for chapter 1. I've only seen them for the introduction. Folks who dialed in with a hand up, the line should be open. Proceed. Folks need a moment to get their notes together, perhaps. I don't know if this book is easy to find or not. I've had my own personal copy of this book for some time, so I didn't look. I know it's still in print. I saw it and got it off my wish list years ago. So I guess if you have difficulties tracking it down, you can let me know. I didn't really process that before thinking about the next book to read. I just assumed I got it. Shouldn't be too much. Shouldn't be too hard for other folks to get it. But you can let me know if I was wrong. I might have miscalculated on that. Let's see. I'll share a thought or two, I reckon, from my second set of notes before we get to callers. Let's see if I can do it correctly this time. Although the headlines were a hoot of the Negroes invading. So we got a lot on eugenics. We had the mention of Madison Grant, who wrote Passing of the Great Race. We did not read that on the book club, but we did mention Lothrop Stoddard, the global threat to white world supremacy. Messed the title up. The rise The Rising Tide of Color, that's it. The Rising Tide of Color Against White World Supremacy. Lathrop Stoddard, we read on the book club way back. I think that was 2016 after Trump was elected. Thankfully, I didn't have to read that, thank goodness. But you can go back in the archives and check that out as well. Those two are right there, same time period. Very influential text. So some of the notes that I took. Let's see, on page 22, she's writing about Herbert Spencer, one of the early Darwinists, into laissez-faire, no rules, do whatever you want. This term of an open marketplace will get used frequently when they start talking about the Environmental Protection Agency and them not having sanctions, and we don't have a lot of regulations, Scott Pruitt and Donald Trump or whomever it happens to be, But they'll say, yeah, we need laissez-faire. That's our capitalism. We want jobs for the American people, white people. We got to get those white people in Appalachia, so we can't have a whole lot of regulations. We need business to be able to get in there and be unregulated. That's what they brag about in Houston. We're unregulated. You could just come in here and get that money. All about the Benjamins. No. System of racism, white supremacy. She says Spencer's ideal society was one that had no social legislation, no regulation of industry, and no assisted relief for the poor, except for white people. It would be a society that would allow natural selection to occur by doing nothing for primitive and lesser people. Feeble-minded, they say. White people are such liars about everything. The notion of we're not going to help, no assisted relief, that is such a lie. White people get assisted relief when they are not even poor. They ask for help and get it when they don't even need assistance. They do this on a regular basis, president included. Mr. Fuller pointed that out. He had an audio clip because must be something about the system of white supremacy where that's important to promote this lie that we do everything, meritocracy, and the rest of you, if you ask for help, you're no good, lazy, shiftless coon. And he said he had a white man on his job, I guess this would be Bureau of Engraving and Printing, right? On his job, who said, I do everything on my own. I never ask for help. Had his chest out real proud. Mr. Fuller said, just what I said, you're a lie. He didn't call him a liar. He said, you just said something that was not true. And the white man got, what do you mean? He said, who did I ask for help? When? He said, I know goodness well, you would not have survived as a baby if you didn't get any help. I know somebody had to learn. If you know how to read, I know you had to get some help and probably lots of it. And I don't think it took more than about 5 seconds for the white man to retract his statement. He said he retracted and said, I apologize. You're correct. But they're not helping the poor. Come on. We're going to Toronto, white people permitting, May 21 through May 24. They brag about having their health care system. Yeah. What do you mean universal health? What do you mean have somebody is poor and they don't have money to pay for it, so we let them die in the street? What are you talking about? They don't have a whole lot of niggers in Canada either. You start looking at other places, Holland, places where they don't, what they call it, homogeneous society, where you have lots of the same people, especially where you have lots of white people. They don't do that stuff of not taking care of that. No. They be getting real Bernie Sanders, like real socialists, like yeah, let's make sure we take care of everybody and we're all in this together, working for white domination worldwide. Let's see. Oh, she said, this is a paragraph over from what I just read. She says, if the unfit could not remedy the environmental problems of their marginalized geographic spaces themselves, they would suffer the natural consequences of their condition, disease, or mortality, and even eventual extinction. This mentality would explain why sanitary infrastructures built at the turn of the century usually benefited primarily the native white communities. That is so important because those are the types of decisions that can end up having ramifications right now, 2020, in terms of when they go in for sanitation, roads, and who gets all of that last, and then they do it in a really inferior manner. That can end up having epigenetics, and when I say epigenetics, meaning things that happen to your grandparents and other family members, traumatic things in particular, that can have an impact on you, and that they have a growing body of science saying that that's true. Thomas in New York said that word body politique. Now I didn't hear the use of the term body politique in the second reading, but I did hear the metaphor body invoked regularly throughout the text, and I just thought that that was interesting in terms, because she was saying body, but it was talking about a group of people, a large group of people, and it was the same type of thing. Are you talking about white people? Are you talking about everybody? That's something I guess we can be mindful of as we read. Next. She's talking about different Darwinists. She says that both Darwinists and eugenicists felt that the poor's environmental conditions stemmed from their own inferiority, of course, blaming the victim. This sentiment was shared by historical contemporary Stanford University President David Starr Jordan, who stated that poverty, dirt, and crime are due to poor human material. I thought that was important because Stanford University is not an Ivy League school. It's in California, close to the Bay Area, but it is widely regarded. Richard Sherman is an alumnus. They have many other standouts, but William Shockley is also an alumnus. Stanford University did the debate with Dr. Francis Cress Welsing. He had some of the exact same views, and I think that's important because that shows how that sort of philosophy can be entrenched and nurtured at these white-dominated institutions for a long period of time. Next, Cory Booker, I believe, is a Stanford alumnus too. Cory Booker does not have a white parent. Still learning I am. Let's see. I thought this was a great one. This is on bottom of 24. She says, she's talking about, again, Foucault, Walker, and Shaler, different Darwinists, suspected racists of the time. All three of these intellectuals' ideologies are consistent with the Foucaultian notion that government was responsible for protecting the larger body from biological threats, and that's exactly what Thomas in New York said. Now, she didn't say body politique, but larger body from biological threats. She's talking about protecting white people collectively from I'll read the rest. Biological threats, which in this case were other whites, who needed to be separated and quarantined from a large native white body. As a result, non-Aryan immigrant stock would end up voluntarily, by self-discipline and involuntarily, occupying environmentally compromised geographic spaces, slums, and ghettos in American cities because of the nativist and racist hostilities from native white Americans. Thought that was really important, and exactly to Thomas's point, unless I mangled it, you can let me know if I'm messing that up. And incidentally, without all this, we're planning to go to Toronto. I am still waiting on my passport. They say the wait time is 6 to 8 weeks. White people can, say, we're not giving you a passport, nigger, and that's going to be that. We've had, I think, Jack Johnson, Paul Robeson, difficulties about their passport, nothing new. So reading all this and them talking about, well, we might let you in and we might not. And in fact, let's see if we can figure out some ways to keep these dark people from immigrating here. Control of borders, who gets in, who gets out, long-running component of the system of white supremacy. But hopefully get that passport. Let's see. Folks who dialed in, comments, thoughts, questions that you wanted to share?
Can I be heard?
Our narrator, Henry in Chicago.
Greetings. At the bottom of page 24, when she quoted Foucault saying that it will become the discourse of a battle that has been waged not between races but by a race that is portrayed, and is the one race, the race that holds power and is entitled to define the norm, and against those who pose a threat, the biological heritage. Now, I saw this quote and I thought about, what is the purpose of race? Is to practice racism. And the one thing that, is always expressed on this program is the only race is the white race. And, everybody else is non-white. So I thought that quote actually encompasses that mindset of, the purpose of race and racism. And what's so interesting is I was thinking about the Altgeld Gardens and the configuration of Chicago, and actually the transit authority, Chicago Transit Authority, and the railway. what's so interesting is in the railway, in the Chicago CTA railway, the railway extends all the way up north to Chicago, actually past Chicago, all the way up to the north suburb of Evanston, which is predominantly white. It even actually extends west out into the west suburbs, and then out to O'Hare, which is northwest, and then southwest as well. But what is so interesting is the railway only goes up to, say, 95th Street. Now, the furthest south of Chicago is 138th, and that is around the area where the Outdoor Gardens live at. They stop the railway at 95th Street. They don't even go any further than 95th. Now, you could take a bus out there, but the railways, have stopped at 95th Street. Now, and I'm just talking about that, and it's like that actually is, not an accident, from my standpoint, because I know they've always talked about it for decades about extending the railway to, past 95th Street, but I know white folks, they're not going to be like, we don't want no railway going, to those polluted areas or anything like that. So, I kind of thought about that, that when I was kind of like reading this book as well. So, that's all I have. I'm in my line.
Much obliged, good sir. That's, unless my math is off, it's about 40 blocks approximately, if it stops around 90th, and Altgeld is around 135th, 138 or so. Good 40 blocks, close to about 45 blocks, really. Good luck, niggers. Walk. Here's a clothespin. Pinch your nose. No, it's a little stinky down there. Have fun on the bus. That's another environmental racism, as opposed to having some form of efficient transportation and to keep more of those vehicles, traffic, and all. No. Get on the bus. And that is a pattern. I talked about this or maybe it wasn't last week specifically, but it was with the last book. In Atlanta, it's the same thing. They have deliberately, it's not by accident, they have deliberately poor public transportation because they don't want the black people, because they got a lot of black people there, moving efficiently through the city. Speaking of Altgeld Gardens, we have done an impressive amount of reading on Chicago. I have visited Chicago. I do like Chicago. It's just too cold. It's just too cold. I don't do cold weather well. President Obama, Dreams from My Father. He talks quite a bit about Chicago. We also read A Foot in Each World. Non-white Chicago journalist. Her name will come to me in a moment, but we read that in 2016. Leonida McClain, Chicago journalist. I think she was one of the first high-ranking black journalists at the Chicago Tribune. But we read her book. She talked about when Harold Washington was elected in Chicago. We've done a number of works. I said Warmth of Other Suns, Isabel Wilkerson, Chicago is prominently featured in that book. Even Beryl Satter, Family Property, she talks about the history of white slumlords. This is right in the same line. We have done quite a bit of reading on Chicago. But President Obama, Chapter 9, he talks specifically about Altgeld Gardens. We read all this. It's in the archives. Somebody just asked me about helping them find this in the archives. I will help them do that. But he writes, talking about Altgeld, I consider the irony of the name, its evocation of something fresh and well-tended, a sanctified earth. True, there was a grove of trees just south of the project, and running south and west of that was the Calumet River, where you could sometimes see men flick fishing lines lazily into darkening waters, but the fish that swam those waters were often strangely discolored with cataract eyes and lumps behind their gills. People ate their catch only if they had to. This was talked about in A Terrible Thing to Waste. Don't want to eat that if you're pregnant. To the east, on the other side of the expressway, was the Lake Calumet landfill, the largest in the Midwest. And to the north, directly across the street, was the Metropolitan Sanitary District's sewage treatment plant. The people of Altgeld couldn't see the plant or open air vats that went on for close to a mile as part of a recent beautification effort. The district maintained a long wall of earth in front of the facility, dotted with hastily planted saplings that refused to grow month after month. Like hairs swept across a bald man's head. But officials could do nothing to hide the smell, a heavy putrid odor that varied in strength depending on the temperature and the wind's direction and seeped through windows no matter how tightly they were shut. The stench, the toxins, the empty, uninhabited landscape for close to a century. The few square miles surrounding Altgeld had taken in the offal of scores of factories, the price people had paid for their high-wage jobs. Now that the jobs were gone and those people that could had already left, it seemed only natural to use the land as a dump and a place to house poor blacks. I'll stop right there. That is Dreams from My Father, former President Barack Obama. Read on the cows. I am upset because the audiobook we read was abridged, and that is like never. We hardly ever do abridged books on the cows, so I think that is in the audiobook, but it may not be. Anywho, other folks who dialed in. Oh, and I did want to say really quick, I have been to Chicago more than once. We went to Northwestern. I believe Northwestern is in Evanston, so you can hop the train and go all the way to Northwestern and hang out in the suburbs with the white people. Northwestern's campus is opulent. I don't think they have too much worry about environmental racism up there. It is, wow, just staggering. Way, way different than when you get down around 130th South Side. Anywho, other folks have comments, thoughts that they wanted to share. See, I'll make sure get in my last few notes if nothing stood out the early portion. Let's see. She said today, it's not funny, but even today, blacks as the penultimate social others continue to suffer disproportionately from environmental policies. Penultimate, that's what I mean if we got that hierarchy. And I like that. I've said consistently, I don't like the term of the, or in my view, it is not constructive. It's not like, shouldn't say like. In this context, I don't think the word other is constructive for revealing truth. I think it would be much more accurate and quicker for everyone to grasp what we're talking about. Black people remain the most terrorized, the most mistreated in a system, in a racial hierarchy, as opposed to penultimate others. Let's see, she says... She uses that phrasing a lot, too. More so than Victorian English poor, African Americans living in Chicago throughout the migration period were highly visible and thought of as being a diseased segment of the larger social body. There it is again, social body and body politique. And she said it this time. Now there, I would say that the social body is white people, that you are a diseased part of the white body, the white collective. We need to get rid of you, or at least, cage you someplace. The aggressive actions by the larger white social body to keep them essentially spatially and environmentally quarantined would lead to violence in the form of race riots and bombings, and eventually to de facto segregation. None of that is footnoted, unfortunately. I was thinking, maybe she'll have more details right there about the bombings, but no. We'll have to do our homework. I have talked to urban architects, the folks that do the plannings for the streets, where a street is going to be and that sort of thing, and why neighborhoods look the way that they do. These were white people, and they were saying that, they design areas, whole neighborhoods sometimes, so that they're kind of hidden and kind of obscure, difficult to get to. Maybe if you don't know it's there, you wouldn't even know that, this route is back there. And it could be massive, like lots and lots of people, lots and lots of homes and things. But it can be deliberately designed as such. These things don't happen by accident. The niggers being last to get toilets and such, it's not by accident. And in fact, I saw that today, Jordan Peele They're redoing Candyman. They don't make anything new in the system of white supremacy. They just keep doing the same thing over and over again. That's set in Chicago. In fact, Gus T., I wrote a counter-racist review of Candyman. It's on my blog. I have to repost it because it's just the same thing. Raping niggers. Can't get enough of raping niggers. But they have a scene where they explain this white woman, the main character, she has a condo in Chicago, and it started off this was going to be a place to warehouse niggers, but they said we didn't have enough separation to keep the coloreds over there. We normally try to use the train track to separate where we're going to have the white body politique and the Negras, but since we weren't able to do that, we just turned this into condos and said we'll sell it to white people. But that's in the film. I wrote it out verbatim in my blog post. Let's see, did I have anything else? One more I'll get. Oh, man, I mentioned the University of Stanford. I could not miss my alma mater, the Coon Man, governor at Virginia right now, Coon Man Ralph Northam. He was at the University of Virginia's med school, unless my memory is bad. She writes, this is page 29, kind of the middle. Hoffman's work was strongly supported by University of Virginia medical professor. These are all eugenicists and Darwinists and racists that I'm mentioning, Hoffman. His work was supported by University of Virginia medical professor and chairman of the faculty, Dr. Paul R. Barringer. In his book, The American Negro, His Past and Future, Barringer made the social Darwinist argument that any social problems that the Negro was encountering were rooted in his own biological inferiority and were an indication that he was, in actuality, reverting to his natural, primitive, savage state. The dogma on biological destiny elucidated by Hoffman and Barringer's works was soon joined by historian Joseph A. Tillinghast in his study The Negro in Africa and America. I love the titles of these books. They just make it plain. The Negro. The Negro. That's what Cliven Bundy said out in Arizona. He was one of those militant whites, white identity extremists. He said, I'll tell you what I've learned in my time studying the Negro. This is 2014, I think, 2015. Anyway. But yeah, as I said, these ideals of white supremacy get entrenched in major institutions. Stanford, the University of Virginia, and this is at the medical school. No, sir. I bet if you ask, Coon Man, do you know anything about Dr. Paul R. Barringer? Did you study any of his work while you were doing your med school time back at good old university? Let's see what he said. In fact, they don't even call professors doctor at the University of Virginia. They say that no one could possibly be more intelligent than Thomas Jefferson. And he was not called a doctor, so you won't be either. UVA.
Can I be heard?
Wahoo wah. Thomas in New York. Yes, sir.
Good evening, Gus, again. Yes, Coon Man. You know, I've been correcting people recently, Gus. When they say the Coon Man was wearing blackface, I'm like, oh, no, we don't know which outfit he was in. He could have been in the Klan outfit. We don't know. You know, it was never cleared up. I was in Chicago in 1995, and boy, I saw the biggest housing projects I ever saw in my life, and I'm going by New York standards. This thing was super huge, Gus. I said, oh my God, people live there? Like, oh, I could imagine the environmental racism. Well, before they knocked those projects down, I think the next year. What they was talking about, Oak Hill Gardens, I think they said it was 103 industrial waste sites inside of the place, 130 factories. I mean, you talk about a toxic breeding ground. You know how they do. And I got this dude in my job. He's an Albanian, and he came here probably 15, 20 years ago, and he got 3 kids, and he has an accent, white till he talks, but he's still white. But I said, I asked him something one day, and he said, oh, my kids, they're not going to have the problems I had because they don't have this accent. So I said, yeah, they're one generation, they're white. Once they lose the accent, it's pretty much, it's over. And I'm doing my line of thinking.
Doesn't take a whole lot. You can work on that. They have speech classes. You can change that last name Really easy. They have lots of examples of that. Matthew Fry Jacobson, man, we talked about all this. September 2009. It's in the archives. Very, very easy. You got a lot of Hollywood white, Hollywood stars, they and or their parents. That is their transition. Parents immigrated from wherever, change that name up, make it more anglicized, as they say. Don't spend a whole lot of time messing around with the colors, and oh yeah, we're good. We won't be living over there in the gardens. We won't have to say we can be at Northwestern at the game, doing it right. Folks satisfied?
Can I be heard?
Oh, go ahead.
Thank you, sir. Yes, I just to enter in on the conversation that y'all are having, the whites, as I mentioned before, when they were bringing in the Irish and the other Eastern Europeans, quote unquote, into this part of the world, they gave them a directions because eventually they were going to ascend them to this white status, and some of those attributes you guys were just mentioning, shortening one's name, changing their dialect to more of a traditional white person's dialect in this part of the world. In other words, losing the accent and the dress customs, those sort of things. You can. I've been to Chicago twice. The first time was in the '80s when just as Harold Washington was being elected mayor. And that's when I first saw the area that Mr. Thomas is talking about. It is one of the largest areas like that in the world in itself. The second time I actually went with Mr. Clark and another less confused non-white person, and we wanted to get right up close to observe and conversate with the people in the area. We weren't able to because of how different we looked. The way we dressed, we looked like detectives. So it wouldn't have been a good time to mingle with the public in that particular case. We were there for a book convention, but I think the book is going to be pretty much interesting, based on the author and her understanding and ideas to make a scientific focus on how racism is affecting the environment where we are forced to have to stay in. And that's all I'd say. Oh yes. I was wondering at the beginning of tonight's program on the tape that you played with the that you had it before with the black male who was involved in the shootings and whatnot. What was that?
Omar Thornton, Connecticut shooting.
Yes, and the connection, because I did come to understand about an hour or two ago that the killer of the in Milwaukee was a black male, and so basically I think you stated that you have that understanding also.
Tomorrow
on how
racism.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Should be interesting. That's it.
Much obliged. Retired firefighter Henry in Chicago.
Okay. just quickly, I'm thinking those housing projects that retired firefighter Thomas saw was either Cabrini Green or the Robert Taylor homes. Both of those have been torn down. The Outgill Gardens are actually the largest standing Chicago housing projects currently in Chicago right now. And also, too, with the mention of Barack Obama, with his, quote unquote activism in the gardens, I know a couple people in the gardens who've been living there for decades, and I've hardly seen any of them have told me that they saw him around. And and it just goes to show that this guy has been a state senator for 4 years. He's been president for 8. And Outgill Gardens is still one of the worst environmentally places, probably not just in Chicago, but probably in the United States. And like I said, I mean, that's all I got to say right now. Mute my line.
Got that library. System of racism, white supremacy. No surprise at all. That is what domination looks like. With that, we will be here in 30 seconds.
I just wanted to say
yes,
Robert Taylor. That's all I want to say. It was the Robert Taylor homes. Yeah.
Robert Taylor homes. There we go.
I went to both.
System of racism, white supremacy. Man. Toronto, that is where I'm looking to visit. May 21 through May 24. Counter-racist yoga retreat. I actually need to stop saying that because I need to double check. Spots are disappearing, so we might not have as many spaces left. I guess drop an email if you're interested to come and hang out and have plant-based meals all the time while we're there. Yoga. Maybe we'll go to the gun range. We'll have to see. Hopefully we'll get to enjoy spring weather. And no pollution. They don't have lots of niggers in Toronto. So hopefully we'll be able to hang out in an environment with clean water and clean, fresh air. You can get outside and do a little yoga if it's not too cold by late May. Drop an email if you have questions, interest, untiljustice@gmail.com. Much obliged for everyone's participation, live or archived. Hope it was worthy of your time and energy. Workplace racism. Whew. Looking forward to tomorrow. With that, sobriety would be best under conditions of white supremacy. We already have enough chemical and biological attacks, assaults on our brain and bodies in general. Let's, try to keep our bodies working well, particularly our brain computers. Harriet E. Washington talked about those toxic, noxious alcohols. In addition to being sober, let's be buckled up every time we are in a vehicle, passenger or driver. If you are behind the wheel, you are sober, buckled up, and not on the cell phone. Again, just trying to do little things that we can from a relatively weak power position to stay as safe as possible. With that, Creator, we ask that you help us remain patient with other black people, victims of white supremacy. We ask that you help us remain patient with ourselves. Remind us to demonstrate the highest levels of black self-respect at all times, in all places, each and every time we are in contact with another black person. It has been time. Replace white supremacy with justice immediately. Cows signing out. Thanks all for tuning in. Get those test strips for your water. Test your water. Cows signing out. Thanks all for tuning in.